Chapter 1. 9 years later. Of course it was bloody raining. For one, it was Wales, so rain literally came with the territory. Rhys understood that. But he'd driven from London that morning through sunshine with the occasional cloud. Gorgeous blue skies, rolling green hills, the kind of day that made one want to take up painting or maybe develop some kind of poetry habit. It was only once he drove into Dewinia, the tiny village where his family had lived for centuries, that it started pissing down. He was fairly sure he knew why. Grimacing, Rhys parked his rental car just off the high street. He didn't have to drive, of course. Could have used a traveling stone, been here in the blink of an eye. But his insistence on driving everywhere irritated his father, and Rhys liked that more than he liked the convenience of magical travel. Although he thought as he got out of the car and frowned up at the sky, today it felt a little like cutting off his nose to spite his own face. But what was done, and Rhys tugged the collar of his coat up a little and set off into the village proper. There wasn't much on the high street. A few shops, a church at one end and at the other a pub. That was the direction he headed in now. There were only a handful of people out this afternoon, but all of them crossed to the other side of the street when they saw him. Lovely to see the family reputation was still robust as ever. At the end of the street, the Raven and Crown beckoned, its windows warm rectangles of light against the gray day. And as soon as Rhys pushed open the front door, he was assailed with some of his favorite smells, the malty richness of beer, the sharp tang of cider and the oaky warmth of aged wood. God, he'd actually missed home. Maybe it was just because he'd been away for so long this time. He usually tried to drop in every few months, more frequently if he thought his father was away. It put him right in between his two older brothers in terms of familial loyalty. Llewellyn, the eldest, ran this pub and stayed in close contact with their father. Bowen, the middle brother, had fucked off to the mountains of Snowdonia 2 years ago, and they got occasional communications from him, mostly to alarm all of them with how intense his beard seemed to be getting. So Rhys was, for once, not the most disappointing son, a title he was happy to hang on to until Bowen decided to stop doing whatever it was he was doing up there. He was never going to be the favorite, though. Wells had won that role long ago, and Rhys was happy to let him have it. Besides, it was kind of fun being the black sheep. When he fucked up, that was taken as a given, and when he managed not to fuck up, everyone was pleasantly surprised. Win-win. Taking off his jacket, Rhys went to hang it on the coat rack by the door, the one just under an old advertisement for Strongbow cider, and as he did, he caught a glimpse of the man behind the bar watching him. And when Rhys turned around, he realized the man behind the bar, his eldest brother Llewellyn, was the only person in the pub. Llewellyn was their father minus 30 years. Same stern expression, same Roman nose. Well, to be fair, they all had that nose, same thin lips. Only slightly less of a prick. But equally committed to staying in this tiny little village where everyone was terrified of him and running this pub that only the occasional tourist, an erstwhile brother, wandered into. "Hiya, Wells," Rhys said, to which Wells only grunted in response. Typical. Business still booming, I see. Rhys sauntered over to the bar, grabbing a handful of peanuts from a glass bowl there. Wells shot him a dark look over the polished mahogany, and Rhys grinned, tossing a peanut into his mouth. "Come on," he cajoled. "Admit that you're delighted to see me." "Surprised to see you," Wells said. "Thought you'd abandoned us for good this time. And forgo such warm fraternal bonding? Never." Wells gave him a reluctant smile at that. "Father said you were in New Zealand." Nodding, Rhys took another handful of peanuts. "Until a couple of days ago. Stag do. Bunch of English guys wanting the full Lord of the Rings experience." Rhys's travel company, Penhallow Tours, had grown from a small, one-man business run out of Rhys's London flat to a 10-person operation, running multiple trips all over the world. His customers routinely called his trips the best of their lives, and his reviews were full of people gushing over how they never had a single day of bad weather. Not one delayed flight, not a solitary case of food poisoning. Amazing how much the smallest bits of magic could do. "Well, I'm glad you're back," Wells said, resuming his cleaning, "because now you can go talk to Father, and get him out of this mood." He nodded at the windows and Rhys turned, seeing the truly abysmal weather in a new light. Fuck me. He'd been right then. No ordinary storm, but one of his father's making, which, yes, meant Rhys had undoubtedly irritated him. His brothers had never provoked a storm from his father. Rhys had caused 20, 24? Too many to count, really. Turning back to Wells, Rhys went to reach for the peanuts again only to have his hand swatted at with a damp towel. "Or," he cried, but Wells was already pointing at the door. "Go up there and talk to him before he floods the main road and I never see a customer again." "Am I not a customer?" "You're a pain in my arse is what you are," Wells replied, then sighed, hands on his hips. Seriously, Rhys, just go talk to him, get it over with. He's missed you. Rhys snorted even as he got up from the bar stool. I appreciate that, Wells, but you're full of shite, mate. An hour later, Rhys was wondering why he hadn't at least stayed at the pub long enough to have a pint. Possibly 3. He decided to walk up to the house rather than antagonize his father with the car. A real show of growth and maturity on his part, he thought. But the closer he got, the worse the weather became, and even the protection spell he'd thrown up over himself was struggling. For a moment he considered dropping it, letting his father see him pathetic and bedraggled, but no, that kind of thing would only work on a father who had a heart, and Rhys was fairly certain Simon Penhallow had been born without one of those. Or maybe he'd removed it himself at some point, some sort of experiment to see just how much of a bastard one man could be. The wind howled down from the top of the hill, making the trees that lined the road creak and sway. And honestly, Rhys knew his father was an incredibly powerful witch, but he didn't have to be such a cliché about it. Also a cliché. The Penhallow family manse, Penhaven Manor. Rhys sometimes wondered how his family had managed to avoid being murdered over the 500 years that they'd called the hulking pile of stone and obvious witchcraft home. They might as well have put signs in the front yard. Here there be witches, for fuck's sake. The house didn't so much sit on the hill as it crouched on it. Only 2 stories tall but sprawling. A warren of dark hallways and low ceilings and shadowy corners. One of the first spells Rhys had taught himself had been a basic illumination spell, just so he could sodding well see things when trying to get to the breakfast table every morning. He also sometimes wondered if the place would have been a little different, a little lighter if his mother had lived. She'd hated the house just as much as Rhys did, according to Wells, and had almost talked their father into moving to something smaller, something more modern and homier. But then she died just a few months after Rhys was born, and any talk of moving out of this monster of a house had been squashed. Penhaven was home. A terrifying, uncomfortable, medieval wreck of a home. It always looked slightly crooked on first approach, the heavy wooden doors slouching on their hinges, and as Rhys climbed the front steps, he sighed, smoothing a hand over the air in front of him. The Henley jeans and boots he'd been wearing shimmered and rippled, transforming into a black suit with his family crest embroidered on the pocket. His father preferred they all wear robes in the house, but Rhys was only willing to go so far in the name of tradition. He didn't bother knocking. His father would have known he was there the second he set foot on the hill, possibly even when he'd gone into the pub. There were guardian spells all over the place up here, a source of endless frustration to Rhys and his brothers whenever they'd been even a little bit late for curfew. As Rhys placed his hand on the door, it swung open, groaning ominously on its hinges, and the wind and rain picked up, gusting strong enough that for just a second Rhys's spell slipped. Icy water slapped him in the face, trickling down the collar of his shirt and plastering his hair back against his head. Wonderful, he muttered. Bloody wonderful. And then he stepped in. Chapter 2. No matter what the weather looked like outside, the inside of Penhaven was always dim. Rhys's father liked it best that way. Heavy velvet drapes covered most of the windows, and the few windows that were left uncovered were made of thick stained glass in dark shades of green and red, distorting the light that came through them, making strange shapes on the heavy stone table just inside the front door. Rhys stood there in the entryway for a moment, looking up at the massive staircase and the life-size oil portrait that hung over it of Rhys, his father, and his 2 brothers. They were all wearing robes, all watching the front door solemnly, and every time Rhys saw the portrait he remembered being 12 and posing for it, hating how still he'd had to be, how sweltering and uncomfortable his robe was, how ridiculous it was that his father wouldn't let them just take a picture and have some painter paint from that. But no, father liked his traditions, and sweating one's balls off while sitting for a massive oil portrait was apparently right up there with cutting your own Yule log and attending Penhaven College in terms of things Penhallow men do. Don't keep me waiting. The voice boomed out from everywhere and nowhere, and Rhys sighed again, running a hand over his hair before jogging up the staircase. His father would be in his library, the chosen theater for almost all confrontations between father and sons throughout the years, and as Rhys opened the heavy double doors leading to that room, he felt immediately transported back in time. Not just in his own memories, although he had plenty of those from this room, but literally. His father's library was somehow, impossibly, even more gothic than the rest of the house. There was black wood, more velvet, heavy silver candelabras covered in years of hardened wax. Overhead, a chandelier made of stag antlers cast gloomy light on the parquet floor. And Rhys had never longed for the bright light of his flat in London more. The open windows, the white linen on the bed, the comfortable couches that didn't dispel clouds of dust whenever anyone sat. Not one velvet item, not so much as a fucking pillow in the whole place. No wonder he never came back here. Simon Penhallow was standing in front of the large mirror he used for scrying and communicating with fellow witches, his hands clasped behind his back, wearing, as Rhys had predicted, his robes. Black ones, of course. His hair was black as well, although sprinkled through with gray, and as he turned around, Rhys thought he looked a little older now. A few more wrinkles around his eyes, more white in his beard. "Do you know how long it's been since you were last in this house?" his father asked, and Rhys spit back a sarcastic reply. He had at least 3 of them, but his father was never the biggest fan of Rhys's wit, so he just stepped into the room, mimicking his father's posture, hands behind his back. "I'm not sure exactly. Half a year," his father replied, because why say a normal thing like 6 months? "It has been half a year since you last visited your father and your family home." "Okay, but in my defense that's still got to be better than Bowen, right?" Rhys offered his father a grin, but as always Simon was the one person Rhys had never been able to charm. "Bowen is involved in something that actually benefits this family, as opposed to you, living the bachelor life in England." Rhys's father had a tendency to say England, as though he meant a sordid pit of debauchery, and not for the first time. Rhys wondered if his father's idea of what his life must be like was not actually far more interesting than Rhys's actual life. Alright, to be fair, there was a bit of debauchery, but on the whole Rhys lived as normal a life as most young men in their late 20s. He ran his travel business, he watched rugby at the pub with his mates, he dated. Nothing out of the ordinary except for the role that magic played in all of those things. His customers always had a smooth and easy trip. His favorite team always won. And while he never used magic on the women he dated, he might have used the occasional charm to make sure he could get a reservation at the restaurant he wanted, or that traffic would never be a hassle. He didn't abuse his powers, but there was no doubt that magic made the path smoother, something Rhys had always appreciated. "You are wasting your potential as a warlock," Simon went on, "engaging in all this frivolity. Warlock isn't a thing anymore, father. I've told you we're all witches now. Have been for literal decades." Ignoring that, Simon continued, "It is time for you to likewise do your duty for this family, Rhys. Which is why I'm sending you back to Glenbed." Glenbed.
Graves Glen.
Vivian. He didn't think of her that often. It had been years. What they'd had burned hot but brief, and there had been other, more serious relationships since her. But every once in a while she came to mind. Her pretty smile. Her hazel eyes. The way she'd tug at the ends of her honey blonde hair when she was nervous. How she tasted. No, definitely not a helpful memory right this second. Better to remember her angry tears, her arms crossed over her chest, the pair of jeans she'd thrown at his head. Christ, what a wanker he'd been. Shaking himself slightly, he stepped closer to his father and said, "Graves Glen? Why?" Simon scowled at him, the hollows beneath his cheekbones deepening. "It's the anniversary of the founding of the town and the college," Simon said. "A Penhallow must be there. Your brothers have other responsibilities, as do I, so it will be you. You should leave as soon as possible, and I'll see to it that the house is prepared for you." He waved one elegant, long-fingered hand. "You are dismissed." "I fucking am not," Rhys countered, and Simon straightened up. Rhys was over 6 feet, but his father, like Wells, had him beat by an inch or two, something Rhys felt profoundly in this moment. Still he held his ground. "Duh," he said, reverting to the name he hadn't used since he was a child. "You know their whole Founders' Days thing has nothing to do with us now, right? It's basically a Halloween party. They sell pumpkins, for Christ's sake, the little painted ones. I think there are stuffed bats involved. It's nothing that requires our presence. And yet our presence will be felt because you will be there," his father said. "Every 25 years, a Penhallow must return to strengthen the ley lines, and this year that Penhallow shall be you." Bollocks. He'd forgotten about the ley lines. 100 years ago, his ancestor, Griffith Penhallow, had founded the town of Glenbed in the mountains of North Georgia, in a spot where the veil was weak and magic was strong. Naturally, the town had called to witches over the years, and the college there, named after the Penhallow family home, taught both regular classes to humans and the arcane arts to witches. Not that the humans who attended the college knew that. They just assumed the historical folklore and practice major was exceedingly hard to get into, and also accepted a fuckton of transfer students. Rhys had been one of those transfer students 9 years ago just for summer classes, and he had several reasons, well, one very big one, not to want to go back. "How do you know that, by the way?" his father asked now, narrowing his eyes slightly. "About Founders' Day. You didn't stay long enough to witness it the last time you were there." "Because I occasionally have one whiskey too many and see what the one who got away is up to, and she still lives there, which is why I definitely don't want to go back," was the truth, but Rhys suspected not the answer to give here. "That town is our family legacy, duh," he said instead. "I've kept up with what's going on there." Rhys was certain the look on his father's face wasn't pride because he was equally certain that Simon taking pride in anything Rhys said or did would cause a rip in the fabric of space and time, but at the very least, his father didn't look actively irritated with him, and that was something. And he hated that still mattered to him. The last time he tried to win his father's approval, it had ended up costing him Vivian. All right, so part of that had been his own utter idiocy in not bothering to mention that he'd agreed to let his father find him the perfect witch bride, but all of it had felt so far away, and Vivian had been right there, real and immediate, not some abstract concept of a woman, and it had been so easy to put off telling her. Until it wasn't, and she had, quite rightly, called him every name in the book, including some he'd never heard of, and stormed out. And now his father was asking him to go back. Do this for your family. Do this for me, Simon said, coming over to lay his hands on Rhys's shoulders. Go to Gwyn bed. He was nearly 30 years old. He ran a successful business that he'd started all on his own, lived a life he loved, was a goddamn adult and did not need his father's approval. And still Rhys heard himself say, fine. I'll go. I told you not to go to a solstice revel. I told you they were nothing but trouble. Head still on the bar, Rhys lifted a hand to give his brother a double-fingered salute. He heard Llewellyn sniff. Well, I did. Yes, and I ignored your brotherly advice to my peril. Thank you, Wells, very helpful. He'd made his way back to the pub after his chat with Simon, and this time he'd actually managed to have that pint. Which was probably the only reason he'd confessed all to Wells. Not just that Dew was sending him to Graves Glen, but about that summer 9 years ago. About Vivian and all the ways he'd mucked it right up. Rhys lifted his head to see that Llewellyn had moved over to the taps, pouring another pint that Rhys very much hoped was for him. This was clearly a 2-pint conversation. Did you love her? Wells asked. Rhys fought very hard not to squirm on the bar stool. His family didn't usually go in for this sort of thing, talking about feelings and such. Wells didn't even have feelings as far as Rhys could tell, and any emotions Bowen might have were reserved for whatever it was he was doing out there in the mountains. I was 20, he said at last, draining the rest of his lager. And it was summer and she was beautiful. So beautiful. And so bloody sweet. He'd felt like someone had hit him solidly in the chest when he'd seen her there at the solstice revel, standing under a violet sky, a flower crown crooked on her head. She'd smiled at him and it had been instant, irrevocable, a fucking disaster. I felt, he said now remembering, as though I might have loving feelings. St. Bugey's balls, that had been hard. How did people just go about talking like this all the time? Wells folded his arms on the bar, leaning in. He had their father's slightly austere features and a sort of resting glare face that Rhys had always found a little alarming, but his eyes were the same clear blue as Rhys's own. Maybe you won't even see her, Wells offered. You'll just be there for what? A day, maybe 2. His smirk turned wry. That's about the maximum you can give to one location, correct? Ignoring the jab, Rhys nodded. I'm going to leave tomorrow. Founder's Day is the day after. Get in, charge the lines, get out. Easy peasy then, Wells said, spreading his hands, and Rhys nodded again even as another vision of Vivian's tear-stained face seemed to float in front of him. The peasy. Chapter 3. The stack of papers on Vivi's desk was screaming, while wailing really a sort of high-pitched shriek. Frowning, she turned away from her computer, and the email she'd been sending her department head to study the papers there on the corner, as they emitted a high sort of wailing sound. With narrowed eyes, Vivi reached for the essays, tossing one after another onto her desk until she found the one she was looking for. Not only did it appear to be shrieking, but the typed letters were slowly bleeding into red. Cheater, cheater, pumpkin eater, she muttered as she checked the name typed in the top corner. Hainsley Barnes. Ah yes, Mr. Lacrosse. No shock there then. He'd missed her last few classes, and apparently no one from last semester had bothered to tell him that Miss Jones was particularly good at sussing out cheaters. Being a witch had so many unexpected perks. Smoothing her hand over the paper, Vivi removed the spell, watching the words turn back to black as the piercing whine slowly faded away, then flagged it with a red post-it before tossing it in a drawer. What in God's name was that sound? Vivi's favorite colleague in the history department, Ezeki, stood in the doorway, wrinkling her nose, and as the paper continued to whimper in Vivi's desk, she gave the drawer a discreet punch. Alarm on my phone, she answered as the sound abruptly cut off, reminding me that I was supposed to wrap up here. She checked the time on her computer. Shit. 30 minutes ago. It was the 3rd time this week she'd been late for the family dinner her Aunt Elaine was so fanatical about, but such was midterm. Vivi shot up from her desk, grabbing her jacket from the back of the chair and her purse as his eye pointed at her. "Girl, do not disappoint the woman who makes my favorite bath salts," she said, and Vivi reached into her bag, pulling out a small muslin sack. "Speaking of, she said to give these to you, so thanks for reminding me." Easy Eye took the bag from Vivi like it contained precious gems, holding it to her chest and taking a deep breath. "No offense, Vivi, but I love your aunt more than I love you." "None taken," Vivi said. "She's magic." Literally, not that Easy Eye knew that. Vivi had made the decision when she'd finished her undergrad at Penhaven College that she'd do a master's in history, regular human history, and that she'd teach regular human kids, as opposed to the witches that took Penhaven's other, slightly more secretive classes. So far it was a decision she hadn't regretted, even if she did suspect she worked a lot harder teaching Intro to World Civ than she would have if she'd been teaching ritual candlemaking. As Vivi jogged up the steps and out of the basement that housed the history department's junior lecturers' offices, she pulled on her jacket and attempted to text Gwyn at the same time. "Ruining ladder." As soon as she hit the doors, her phone pinged in her hand. "I speak Vivi, so I know that means you're running late. Don't text and drive. Or text and walk either." Grinning, Vivi headed out into the quad. It wasn't dark yet, and the October night was pretty mild even up here in the mountains. Nestled in the valley, Penhaven College was a little gem of red brick buildings and green grass, tall oak trees and neatly trimmed hedges, and Vivi loved it more than a person should probably love her workplace. But she did love it. Especially now with the first hint of fall in the air, the leaves orange, the sky purple. Penhaven was always at its best in the autumn. So was all of Graves Glen. Vivi noticed that the decorations for tomorrow's Founders' Day, the beginning of Graves Glen's big Halloween season, were up. There were the electric candles in the window of the written WYRD, the town's bookshop, and plastic pumpkin decals stuck to the door of Coffee Cauldron. Of course, Elaine and Gwyn's store, Something Wicked, was all decked out, and Vivi was pretty sure she even spotted a dangling bat in front of her accountant's office. She hadn't grown up in this little slice of perfection in the North Georgia mountains. Her parents had lived in Atlanta, and while Vivi missed them both a lot, she'd always be grateful she'd landed here in this spot that felt tailor-made for her somehow. This perfect small town where she could balance being a witch and a regular woman. Best of both worlds. Elaine's house was set high on a hill at the end of a winding road, and as Vivi drove up under the bright orange and red leaves, her tires bumping on the dirt road, she felt her shoulders start to relax a little, and once the cabin came into sight, she actually sighed with happiness. Home. Once she'd parked behind Elaine's ancient Volvo, Vivi jogged up the front steps, past the grinning pumpkins and dangling bats and little lights in the shape of purple witches. Aunt Elaine always went all in for Halloween. Just inside, Vivi stopped to pet Sir Percival where he was curled up in his basket. He was massive now, a hulking mass of black fur and green eyes who adored Gwyn and tolerated Elaine and Vivi, and she considered herself lucky when he only took the laziest of swats at her hand before settling back into sleep. "I know I'm late again," Vivi called out as she gave him one last pet. Elaine drifted into the hallway, her ash blonde hair piled messily on top of her head, her black skirts brushing the floor. If Stevie Nicks taught middle school art was the way Gwyn always described her mother's look, and that was not far off. But it worked on Aunt Elaine in a way Vivi never could have pulled off. She'd stick to her floral prints and polka dots. "You know," Aunt Elaine said, placing a bearinged hand on her hip, "if you just come to work for me, you would be around all the time and never have to worry about being late." An old argument, and one that, as usual, Vivi waved off. "You two do fine without me." Something Wicked sold various witchy things, from candles to scarves to soap, with the occasional homemade jam thrown in. Business always picked up this time of year, thanks to Founders' Day, but it wasn't unusual for them to go days without a single sale, so Elaine and Gwyn could easily run the place by themselves. "We might do even better with you though," Elaine said as Vivi moved down the hallway and into the kitchen. Of all the rooms in the house, this one always felt the most witchy. Copper pots hanging from hooks on the ceiling, little pots of herbs all along the windowsill, Elaine's candle-making supplies cluttered on the table. The effect was only slightly spoiled by Gwyn standing by the stove, wearing a t-shirt that said, "Which don't kill my vibe," and eating macaroni and cheese out of the pot. "Business has picked up so much in the last few years," Elaine went on, languidly moving back toward the table. "Gwyn can barely keep up with the online orders." Gwyn nodded, her messy bun of red hair nearly coming undone. "Everyone's a witch these days," she said, mouth full. "We sold like 100 sets of tarot cards last month alone." Vivi raised her eyebrows as she went to the fridge to grab a bottle of wine. "Geez, seriously?" Her aunt's business had always been more of a hobby than an actual moneymaker, but Elaine had refused to get anything resembling a real job, and Gwyn wasn't all that inclined to join the workforce either. Self-care and all that, she said now, placing the pot back on the stove and crossing one foot over the other. Glancing down, Vivi could see she was wearing the bright green and black striped socks that were perpetual bestsellers at Something Wicked. Tarot cards, crystals, candles, grimoires. Gwyn ticked the items off on her fingers. We can barely keep things in stock. I'm going to have to hire someone just to handle the online store. You could totally do that. I like my job, Vivi insisted, and the truth was she did. Sure, there were the occasional lacrosse cheaters, but she could more than handle them. And she loved going to work on Penhaven's campus. She loved going to the big cafeteria for lunch, loved her office with its comfy chairs, loved sharing her own love of history with her students. All in all, it was a good fit and it made her feel stable, safe. Two of Vivi's favorite words. As Vivi opened the wine, Gwyn's phone buzzed and she sighed. I swear to the goddess, if this is another text about Founders Day shit, I am going to go full carry on this town. The mayor, Elaine said to Vivi in a stage whisper. She keeps texting Gwyn about Founders Day because she has a crush on her, and this is her way of getting Gwyn to pay attention to her. A solid move, Vivi allowed, pouring herself some wine, and Gwyn rolled her eyes. I've already slept with her, Mom, it's not that. Also a solid move. Vivi lifted her glass and, distracted, Gwyn clinked her own against it. No, she's just freaking out because it's her first Founders Day as mayor and she wants everything to go well, Gwyn said, her fingers moving rapidly over the phone. And she's a normal human, not a witch, so you can see where these kinds of things stress her out. Does she know you're a witch? Vivi asked, and Gwyn blew a raspberry. God no. That is privileged information one only gets after the fourth date. You never go on a fourth date, darling, Elaine said, lining up her candles on the table. Exactly, Gwyn said with a wink. She went to put her phone back in her pocket only to have it buzz again, and she groaned. Jane, honestly, you're hot, but the sex was not good enough to warrant. Oh shit. What? Vivi and Elaine asked in unison as Gwyn stared at her phone, her eyes wide. Nothing. Nothing at all. She sent me a nude. I'm shocked and scandalized. By the nude. Hastily shoving her phone in her back pocket, Gwyn picked up her wine and turned her attention to Vivi. So, how is teaching the normies going? Vivi said, placing a hand on her hip. You are the worst liar in the entire world, Guinevere Jones. What did Jane say that made you make that face? Gwyn looked between Vivi and Elaine, who was watching her with eyebrows raised, and finally groaned, wine sloshing out of her glass as she threw up her hands. Because it's the 100th anniversary of the town's founding, they're sending a penhallow. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence in the kitchen as all three women took that in. A penhallow. Vivi sipped her wine. There were lots of penhallows. Okay, there were 4 that she knew about. Simon Penhallow, terrifying witch, and his 3 sons. One of whom had shattered her heart into a billion pieces when she was 19, which had been a long time ago, and was a thing she had completely moved past. Mostly. It might not be him, Elaine finally said, turning back to her candles. Might be that nightmare of a father of his. Probably is, Vivi agreed. 100th is a big deal. And while Rhys might have changed a lot in the past 9 years, I still don't see him as being the one you'd send for big ceremonial things, right? Oh, totally, Gwyn said, nodding and pouring more wine into her glass. You send in Rhys for the fun shit like solstice revels and those weird summer courses the college offers. You don't send him in to charge the ley lines. Of course you don't, Vivi said. I'm sure they wouldn't dream of it, Elaine declared, tapping the table for emphasis. But, Gwyn added slowly, maybe we should check? Chapter 4. We haven't done witchy shit together in ages. Vivi stood in Gwyn's bedroom feeling the oddest sense of déjà vu. It wasn't like she hadn't been in here tons of times since the night of all that weirdness after Rhys. She had. But it was the first time she'd been back up on an autumn night with a salt circle on the floor and magic afoot. Gwyn, our entire lives are witchy shit, she reminded her cousin as she attempted to sit on the floor in her pencil skirt. But Gwyn just shook her head, turning around with her arms full. Vivi spotted at least 3 candles, an altar cloth, a silver bowl, and a small black bag done up with a gold clasp. No, I mean the real deal kind of witchy shit, she said, lowering herself to the hardwood. Coven-type stuff. Getting the craft on. Smiling, Vivi hiked up her skirt, crossed her legs, and took a sip of her wine. Not since the night Rhys and I broke up, she said, and Gwyn waved her off. That didn't count. That wasn't real magic. The last time we did real magic was senior year? Maybe. That Beltane. Remembering, Vivi nodded. Okay, well, as long as we don't accidentally summon demons, I'm in. It was just that once, and technically it was a very pissed-off elemental spirit. Vivi shot Gwyn a look over the rim of her glass. Do you remember how long it took my eyebrows to grow back? Dropping her pile of supplies onto the little rug in the middle of the floor, Gwyn heaved a sigh. Vivi, if you bring bad energy into this, it's not going to work. I feel like you're just saying that to get out of the eyebrow conversation. Gwyn didn't reply to that, opening the little black bag and pulling out a deck of tarot cards. Ooh, Vivi said, reaching for the deck, but Gwyn batted her hand away. No touching. Not until I'm ready. But I haven't seen this one before, Vivi said, and Gwyn grinned, spreading the cards out on the floor. Even in the dim lamplight, their colors practically glowed, and Vivi caught a glimpse of a diaphanous white gown on the Empress, bright butter yellow on the sun. Gwyn had been painting her own cards for years, ever since they were teenagers, and not for the first time, Vivi felt a little pang in her heart looking at her cousin's handiwork. Not just because the cards were beautiful, although they definitely were, but because Gwyn always seemed so connected to her craft in a way that Vivi had just never felt. Sure, she liked doing the occasional spell, and her little apartment over the store contained more candles than was probably wise, but she'd never had this. Never had what Gwyn and Elaine had, this ease with magic. Both of them did spells big and small as easily as breathing, and yet every time Vivi used magic, even the little things like her anti-cheater spell, something in her paused, held back. There were times she wished her mom had been a little more open about the whole witch thing. Maybe if she'd grown up doing magic, she'd feel more comfortable with it now. Shaking her head, Vivi pushed that thought away. It didn't matter now. She had exactly as much magic as she liked, no more no less. Gwyn had set the silver bowl on the rug and affixed a fat white candle to the bottom of it. Now she ran her hands over her cards, humming softly as she slid one from the deck. The magician was dressed in bright red robes, a white crystal crown on her head, and Vivi smiled as she realized the figure was clearly modeled on Elaine. She could even spot Sir Percival winding himself around her ankles, his eyes a glittering green. So, Gwyn said before taking a sip of her own wine. First things first, we find out if you have any bad luck right now. Bad luck, they send Rhys. Good luck, it's one of his brothers or his dad. Maybe a hot cousin. That seems much more likely, Vivi admitted, as Gwyn lit the candle in the silver bowl. I mean, Rhys hated dealing with family stuff. I can't imagine he'd want to come back here. Not after I threw his own pants at him and called him something bad? We'll soon find out, Gwyn said, pulling 4 more cards from her tarot deck. She slid the magician in with them, her long fingers dexterous as she shuffled the 5 cards, sliding them back and forth over one another until Gwyn had no idea just where the magician had ended up. Okay, the simple part. Turn over these cards one at a time, Gwyn said, laying the cards face down on the floor. If the magician pops up in the first 3, bad luck. Frowning, Vivi studied the cards in front of her. Gwyn had painted the backs too. A swirling pattern of green and purple spirals, and Vivi let her fingers dance over them for a moment before turning over the first card. A man stood at the edge of a cliff, one foot lifted like he was seconds from stepping off, his eyes blue over the rim of a pair of sunglasses, his shirt unbuttoned to the middle of his sternum. Vivi's heart did a little flip-flop in her chest because that sure was a familiar face. Then she looked at what card it was. The Fool? She asked, lifting her eyes to Gwyn's. Gwyn just shrugged, leaning back on her hands. I take inspiration from everywhere, and when it came time to paint that one, he just leapt to mind. Am I wrong? The Fool was all about risks and chances, leaping without looking, so no, Rhys was not necessarily a bad model for that card. Still. So is this bad? Vivi asked. She lifted it between her thumb and index finger, shaking the card slightly. Does this mean it is him? No, Gwyn said firmly, shaking her head. Well, I mean, probably not. I don't know. Let's see what the next card is. Vivi turned over the next one. The magician, wearing her aunt's calm face, stared back up at her. Rhiannon's tits, Gwyn said, sitting up so fast that her knee nearly clogged her glass. They are sending him. Vivi wished her pulse hadn't suddenly sped up at that, wished her hands weren't trembling slightly as she reached out to flip over the last 3 cards. The star, which was clearly Vivi, standing on a desk in a classroom in a polka dot dress, an apple in one hand, a glowing orb in the other. The tower, Elaine's cabin, but with a massive crack up the center of it, half the house sliding off a cliff, and last, the moon, which was a werewolf. Vivi asked, holding up the card for Gwyn, who rolled her eyes and plucked it from Vivi's fingers. Do not question my artistic vision, Vivian, she said, sliding the moon along with the other 4 cards back into her deck. The two of them sat there on the floor, staring at the candles, and finally Vivi said, "So this is dumb."
Gwyn glunkedip.
"Which part? Him coming? Us finding out he's coming? You feeling weird about him coming? How many times I've said the word coming?" "All of the above," Vivi said, rising to her feet and sliding her skirt back into place. "Look, this was always bound to happen. His family founded this town and the college where, let me add, I happen to work. He's part of this place. I knew that when I got involved with him. And," she lifted a finger in the air, "I have had many boyfriends since him. To be fair, you've had 3. Which is more than 2, which is a couple. So therefore as many. Gwyn, whose side are you on?" "Yours," Gwyn hastily acknowledged. 100%. "It's no big deal," Vivi went on as she searched for her shoes near Gwyn's bed. "He'll come, he'll do his whole Founder's Day look at me I'm fancy thing and stuff will go back to how it was. I can continue to live a penhallow-free life. Except for the part where there's a statue to his ancestor downtown. And also your workplace is literally named after his house. Except for that. Remember when we pretended to curse him?" Gwyn asked, grinning as she shuffled her cards, and Vivi snorted. "Something about his dimples and never being able to find a clitoris again." "Which," Gwyn said, tilting her head to one side, "now that I think about it was actually more a curse against any women he dated, and I kind of regret that. For the sisterhood." Laughing, Vivi shook her head. "It doesn't matter anyway. I may have done the occasional light social media stalking and he seems fine. Better than fine, really. He was still handsome, apparently ran some super chic travel business that took groups all over the world to do various glam things, and probably still knew exactly where the clitoris was. She and Gwyn had just been 2 silly, drunk witches, joking around and lucky that no actual magic had been employed. Whatever had happened with that candle had been a fluke, clearly. Vivi had just reached down to slip on her boots when Gwyn's bedroom door flew open. "Mom!" Gwyn yelped, leaping to her feet. "Did the Daniel Spencer incident teach you nothing?" Elaine just waved a hand at that, even as Sir Percival lurched into the room, meowing balefully at all of them. "Well?" she asked, and Vivi walked over to Gwyn's desk, leaning against it. "Cards say yes," she said, and Elaine looked briefly at the ceiling, muttering something under her breath. "But," Vivi said, pointing with her empty wineglass, "as I was just telling Gwyn, it's actually not that big of a deal. We're all grown-ups here, and it's not like he'll stay long. I'm telling you, I bet I won't even see." Chapter 5. Rhys wasn't sure what he'd done to the universe to deserve this day. First there'd been the flight. That had gone well enough, but it had been long, and getting a rental car in Atlanta had been frustrating, though no more so than navigating Atlanta traffic to make his way north had been. There had been one point, feeling profoundly discombobulated on the wrong side of the car on the wrong side of the road, staring at the back of a semi-truck in front of him, that Rhys had nearly broken and called his father to grudgingly ask for a traveling stone for his return journey. He hadn't ended up sacrificing his pride on that particular altar and had survived the drive to Graves Glen with his sanity intact, but once he'd gotten into the town, it had been one clusterfuck after another. He'd gotten a speeding ticket roughly 5 seconds after he'd passed the sign welcoming him to Graves Glen. Annoying and expensive, and to his mind slightly unjust, given that he was only going 10 miles over and the town wouldn't bloody well exist without his family, but not enough to ruin his day. No, that had come just half an hour ago when, halfway up the hillside leading to the Penhallow home, he'd blown a tire. By that point, his patience had been too low to do something so perverse as change it himself, so he'd waved his hand at the thing to repair it only to have the tire blow up to twice its normal size before popping like a goddamn balloon. And when he'd attempted to float the spare out of the boot of the car, it had gone madly spinning into a tree before rolling down the hill. Which meant that he was stuck in the woods at night, a good half-mile from the house, mud covering his best boots, and his magic apparently on the fritz. Marvelous. This, Rhys thought as he reached into the back seat to pull out his bag, was why he should have stayed in Wales. Hell, he could have run the pub while Llewellyn dealt with all of this. Wells probably wouldn't have insisted on flying and driving. Wells would have been sensible and used the traveling stone, been in and out in a flash, and Rhys might have discovered some heretofore undiscovered talent for pulling pints. Might have changed his whole life. But no, Wells was back at the Raven and Crown, and Rhys was here on a hillside in Georgia with a completely useless car, and he would bet the entire contents of his wallet that his father hadn't seen fit to stock the house with any kind of alcohol. He had just started the trudge up the hill when he heard the sound of a car approaching. Sending up a prayer to the goddess that his luck had actually turned for the better, Rhys shouldered his bag, waving his arms over his head as the headlights coming down the hill nearly blinded him. Rhys made sure to stand near the edge of the road and look as affable as possible, smiling even as he squinted in the glare, and he was still smiling even as the car didn't stop. And not only did it not stop, it seemed to be veering slightly to the right. He was on the right. Rhys had only a moment of dazed thought. This person is going to hit me. I am going to die on a hill in Georgia. What an utterly shite way to go, before he dove out of the way. Distantly, he heard the squeal of brakes, smelled burning rubber, but given that he had just thrown himself down the side of a steep hill, he had slightly more pressing concerns. Like stopping this slide into darkness and, if possible, saving his leather jacket. The jacket was clearly not going to make it. He heard a truly awful tearing sound as he threw one arm out and clutched at a stray root, but the rest of him was all in one piece as he came to a stop several yards down the hill from the road. Above him, he could still see the glow of headlights, and he heard a car door open and slam shut, and then the crunching of leaves underfoot as someone rushed toward the hill he was currently at the bottom of. "Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God!" A very familiar voice breathed, and yes, of course. The universe still clearly hated him. "I am so sorry," Vivian cried as she made her way down the hill, and Rhys turned his head to see her making her way toward him, her arms out to one side. She was just a silhouette, a dark figure against even more darkness, but even if he hadn't heard her voice, he would have recognized her, would have known that shape anywhere. Even after 9 years. Even in the dark. Fucksake. Rhys let his head drop back to the ground as he studied the sky above him, and waited for the inevitable moment when she'd figure out who she'd almost hit and possibly get back in her car and finish the job. "I didn't even see you until you jumped," he heard her say from very close now. And it was the weirdest thing, it was like the brakes just locked up, and the steering wheel had a mind of its oof. Rhys's hands came up automatically as Vivian tripped over his prone form, but it was too late to catch her, and now he got to add a seriously sharp elbow to the testicles to his list of grievances. "I'm sorry," she said again, scrambling to push herself up, her body half draped over his even as he attempted to curl in on himself. "No worries," he managed to wheeze, and then her hands were on his chest, her hair hanging down in his face, brushing his lips. "Rhys." Some of the pressure on his chest eased as she lifted a hand, and with a flick of her fingers, a soft light hovered over the pair of them there on the ground. Any hope he'd had that whatever he'd felt for her 9 years ago had been a mad mix of summer and magic and hormones was immediately squashed as he looked into those hazel eyes, took in her flushed cheeks and her parted lips. Likewise, any hope that she might have forgiven him in the intervening years died a groaning death as she narrowed her eyes and said, "I shouldn't have tried to slow down." "Good to see you too, Vivian," he said, still a little breathless from his slide down the hill and near emasculation. Pushing herself off him, Vivian rose to her feet and began brushing the leaves and various debris from her skirt. Her polka dot skirt. Her whole dress was polka dot. He saw now little orange ones on a black background. Had he always found polka dot so instantly, intensely erotic? Wasn't really a thing he'd considered before, and it was possible he'd hit his head somewhere in his fall, but there was nothing for it now. Polka dots had replaced black lace and red satin in any sexual fantasy he might have for the rest of his life. The light she'd conjured up still floated by her head, and as she picked the last stray leaf off her black jacket, she looked back down at him. "Why were you on the road?" she asked, and he nodded back up the hill. "Flat tire." Vivian snorted, pulling her jacket tighter around her as another gust of wind rustled the trees. "So you couldn't change it magically or physically?" "Having a bit of a night, to tell the truth." "Same." "And why were you on this road, Vivian? Did you hear I was coming back?" "Don't flatter yourself. My aunt still lives on this road, and I was heading home from dinner with her and Gwyn." "Ah, Gwyn," he said, remembering her cousin, a pink-haired witch who, he suspected, had hated him on sight. "Smart girl. How is she? And your aunt?" Vivian sighed, tipping her head back to look at the sky. "How about we not do this?" she said, and Rhys rolled onto his side, propping himself up on one elbow. "What, talk to one another?" "Make small talk," Vivian said, looking down her nose at him. "Neither of us is any good at it." For a long moment they stared at each other, Rhys still on the ground, Vivian standing above him, and he remembered they'd been in a similar position the last time he'd seen her, right after she'd leapt out of his bed when he told her that he had to go back to Wales to get out of his betrothal. Looking back on it now, it was easy to see that he had perhaps not handled that conversation as well as he could have, but he'd thought she'd understand. She was a witch too, after all. She knew all about betrothals. As his genes hitting him in the head had swiftly taught him, Vivian did not in fact know all about betrothals, and that whole magical summer had come to a literally screaming halt. Until now. "I'm here for the ley lines," he finally said, sitting up and shaking the twigs out of his hair. "I know that," she replied, crossing her arms over her chest. Cutting it kind of close, aren't you? Only showing up the night before Founder's Day. I didn't want to spend much time here, he said, then gave her a sardonic grin. Can't imagine why, given the warm welcome and all. Rolling her eyes, Vivian turned to head back up the hill. Okay, well, I'd say I was sorry about nearly killing you, but we both know that's a lie, so I'll leave you to find your own way home. Or, Rhys offered, coming to his feet, you could be the absolute darling I know you are and give me a ride? She spun around, that light still bobbing like a demented firefly. And why would I do that? Well, Rhys said, lifting a finger. For one, I am in town for altruistic purposes that benefit you and your family. 2-inch, another finger. When you were on top of me, I did not make a single pervy reference to other times we'd found ourselves in that position. Except that you're doing that now, but continue. And 3. Rhys lifted the last finger, then looked down at his hand and frowned. Actually, number 3 was going to be a pervy reference to our past, so probably best you leave me here to die. To his surprise, the corner of her mouth ticked up a little at that. Not quite a smile, certainly nothing as robust as a laugh, but it was something. She had liked him once after all. Quite a lot, really. And he'd liked her too. That had been the worst part of it all when it ended. Rhys had never met anyone he liked just as much as he lusted for. And it had made missing her 10 times worse. Even now, battered and bruised and possibly standing in squirrel shit, he was happy. Glad to see her. Brush with vehicular homicide aside. Maybe coming back wouldn't be so bad after all. And then she turned away with a sounds good. The light above her blinked out and Rhys stood, dumbfounded, as she marched up the hill, never once looking back at him. He was still standing there when he heard her car door open and close, the engine start, and the tires crunch down the dirt road. In the aftermath, the only sounds were the wind picking up yet again and the faint skittering of some nocturnal animal. Fair play, I suppose, Rhys said to the darkness. Fair play. Sighing, he looked back up the hill and picked up his bag from where it had landed, and slinging it over his shoulder, lifted his free hand to summon up his own light. His fingers sparked, and a bolt of flame suddenly shot out, hitting the nearest tree limb and sending it crashing to earth with a crack and a smell suspiciously like burned hair. Right, Rhys said, stomping on the smoldering leaves and actually grateful that he could feel the first fat droplets of rain start to fall. The sooner he was out of Graves Glen, the better. Chapter 6. So you just left him there. Gwyn, I've told you the story 3 times already, and that's just today. I texted it to you and called you about it last night. Vivi reached up to readjust the little papier-mâché which hanging over the cash register at something wicked, and Gwyn, standing behind the counter, leaned forward, putting her chin in her hands. I know, but it's my favorite story. I want it played at both my wedding and my funeral. I want to do it as a dramatic monologue at an open mic night. I get it, Vivi said, laughing as she held up her hand. But seriously, it wasn't that big of a deal. You almost ran your ex-boyfriend over with a car, and then left him lying in the literal dirt on the side of the road. It is such a big deal, you absolute queen. Vivi smiled again, but if she were being honest, she still felt a little. Well, not guilty exactly. Rhys was a powerful witch, and he'd been maybe a half-mile from the Penhallow house. He could take care of himself. But maybe it had been kind of bitchy to just leave him there. Especially after he'd been surprisingly chill about the whole, nearly run-over thing. Of course, that wasn't actually surprising. Chill was Rhys's default setting after all. And charming. He'd been really freaking charming last night. Suppressing a sigh, she moved over to the display of crystal balls, running her hands over the nearest one. Elaine's store was just as cozy and perfect as her house, and today, decked out for Founder's Day, it was at its absolute best. Candles had been lit, filling the store with the smell of bay and sage, and crystals were spilled out on black velvet tablecloths like recently discovered jewels. Even Gwyn looked magical and mystical today, decked out in a clingy black dress and knee-high suede boots, her long red hair curling around her face. Vivi was a little more subtle in her black pants and purple striped sweater, but then she was just the local history teacher, not the proprietress of the town's witch shop. Besides, she'd been distracted this morning. She'd spent a solid 10 minutes in the shower replaying last night, and for all the time that had passed, for all the tears she'd cried over the awful way it had ended, when she'd looked down into those blue eyes, that same hank of dark hair falling over his forehead, that same lazy grin, her heart had knocked solidly against her ribs, her stomach had dropped, and she wasn't even going to think about what certain other parts of her had done. Needless to say, her body definitely remembered how much it had liked his, which was deeply unfair and quite frankly treasonous of it. Taking a deep breath, She closed her eyes and reminded herself of the mantra she'd come up with driving away from him last night. He is the worst, he is the worst, he is the actual literal worst. It probably wasn't that enlightened a mantra, but it got the job done, and when she opened her eyes it was a little easier to remember there were good reasons she'd left without a second glance both 9 years ago and last night. Were you just picturing having sex with him?
Vivi klare that's Gwyn.
No, she lied, and was saved from any more questions by the ringing of the chime over the door. We're not open yet. Gwyn called out, but it wasn't an early Founders Day customer coming in, it was the mayor. Vivi looked over at Jane Ellis, a tiny brunette who had a seriously great stiletto game. Today's pair were bright orange, working nicely with her black suit and the skull studs in her ears. Have either of you seen Rhys Penhallow? She asked, her fingers moving over her phone even as she looked between Gwyn and Vivi. I haven't, Gwyn said slowly, looking over at Vivi. Clearing her throat, Vivi stepped forward and with supreme effort, kept from fidgeting with her hands. Gwyn always said that was her tell. I bumped into him last night, she offered. He was on his way up to the house. With a frustrated sound, Jane looked down at her phone. Well, he's due to give the Founders Day speech in 20 minutes, and he has yet to check in at the welcome booth. Vivi relaxed a little. Okay, if that was the only cause for concern, maybe Rhys wasn't actually lying dead in a ditch on the side of the mountain. The words welcome booth were probably up there with fiscal responsibility and ethical monogamy, in terms of phrases he'd shy away from. I haven't been able to reach him on his phone, but maybe I'm fucking up the whole international number thing, I don't know, Jane went on. In any case, Founders Day can't start until we do all the speeches, and he's on the program. She looked up at Gwyn, beseeching. He's on the program. He'll turn up, Vivi said, laying a reassuring hand on Jane's arm only to step back slightly because, good God, the woman was actually vibrating. How much coffee had she consumed this morning? Vivi could go look for him, Gwyn said, and Vivi wondered if some witches had the power to kill with their minds because that sure would be handy right about now. I mean, Gwyn went on, barely suppressing her grin. You've never met him, Jane, and he and Vivi are old friends. Really? Jane turned to Vivi and for the barest second, her fingers stopped typing. Why didn't you say? Vivi sniffed and waved a hand. Oh, it was ages ago and we haven't kept in touch. And like I said, I'm sure he'll be here. Tradition is really important to the Penhallows, and he came all this way just to do this. And he's definitely not dead. I did not actually leave him to die or get eaten by wolves. There aren't any wolves left in Georgia, I'm pretty sure. Although there are bears. You know what, I will just go mill around, see if I can find him, okay? As Vivi hustled out of the shop, she heard Gwyn say to Jane, see? Problem solved. Vivi definitely hoped so. The main street through Graves Glen's downtown was already starting to fill up even though the sky was gray and the temperature had dropped overnight, going from pleasantly autumnal to downright crisp. As Vivi looked up, clouds moved quickly overhead, and she hoped the whole thing wasn't about to be rained out. They'd had hot, humid Founders Days before, but usually the magic thrumming under everything kept bad weather at bay. A gust of wind blew down the street, rattling the plastic pumpkins hanging from the old-fashioned gas lamps, and Vivi wished she'd grabbed her coat from the back room of something wicked. Hopefully she'd spot Rhys pretty quickly, get him over to the welcome booth, and then she could spend the rest of the day helping Elaine and Gwyn out at the shop. She'd be damned if she was going to stand in the crowd and watch Rhys make a big speech about the history of the town, his family honor or whatever it was he was actually planning to say. As she passed a family all dressed up like witches, complete with the pointy hats, Vivi smiled. She loved Founders Day, even when it involved her ex. It kicked off the whole Halloween season, and the town filled up with people really committed to having fun. According to Aunt Elaine, in the past, Founders Day had been a more somber affair, a recognition of the sacrifices the Penhallows had made in founding this little village, tucked away in the mountains. Griffith Penhallow had died his first year here, after all, and there was a legend that his ghost still roamed the hills above the town. But over the past decade, and after a series of mayors like Jane, Graves Glen had transformed itself into a Halloween hotspot. There was the name, of course, but also the whole charming small town thing, the trees glowing bright orange, the apple orchards just on the edge of the village. And since Founders Day was October 13th, it had slowly morphed into the natural starting point of their busiest season. Sorry, Griffith. There were already booths set up selling everything from candy apples to Halloween trees. Little miniature Christmas trees painted black, and decorated with wooden pumpkins, witch hats and ghosts. Vivi waved at several people she knew, including Easy Eye, who was buying a giant bag of kettle corn with her boyfriend, Stuart, and kept her eyes peeled for that familiar lanky gait, that rumpled hair, those broad shoulders. Finally, just when she was about to think he might actually be in a bare stomach somewhere between her aunt's cabin and the bottom of the mountain, Vivi spotted him. He was standing just outside Coffee Cauldron, a truly enormous paper cup in hand, and as Vivi approached he pulled the coffee in even closer. Vivian, I have already had a morning. If you're here to attempt to kill me again, I warn you, it will be very unsporting of you. His eyes were hidden by sunglasses despite the gray day, a look that would have been douchey on any other man, but one that he was, unsurprisingly, pulling off. It helped that the rest of his outfit was equally great. Gray trousers, a white button-down unbuttoned just so, a deep charcoal vest and around his neck, a silver pendant with a dark purple jewel. Vivi had a sudden, explicit memory of that same pendant dangling against her chest as he'd moved above her, inside her, and felt her face flame hot. She hadn't even liked jewelry on men before him, but that necklace suited him, the delicacy of the chain emphasizing the width of his chest, the adornment making him somehow more masculine, not less. Rhys sipped his coffee and didn't say anything, but she felt like he probably knew what she was thinking. Which might have been why her tone was a little sharp when she said, "You need to go to the welcome booth." He pulled a face. "The fuck is that?" Rolling her eyes, Vivi took him by the elbow, steering him away from the coffee shop and toward the row of tents set up in the side street between Something Wicked and the written WARD. "The mayor is freaking out that you haven't checked in yet, so go check in." "Were you worried?" he asked, and she didn't like how delighted he sounded. "Did you think I died? Did you think your callous actions had resulted in my death? I think you need to go check in, make your speech and go home, Rhys." He stopped, pulling them up short, and as he turned to look at her, Rhys reached up to slide his sunglasses down his nose. "I need to check in, make my speech and charge the ley lines. Then I can go home." Vivi could feel a few heads turn their way. She only spotted a handful of other witches in the crowd, people she knew from the college, so most of the people looking at them had no idea who Rhys was. He was just the kind of person who attracted stares. She'd really liked that about him. Once. Now she leaned in and said, "Okay, maybe don't announce that to the whole town and half the tourists in Georgia, but yes, that and then home. The going home part is really what I want you to focus on." Vivi went to tug him back down the street again, but he stood firm, and she'd forgotten that for someone who looked so rangy, he was a pretty solid guy. He definitely wasn't moving. "Come with me." She blinked. "To Wales." That slow smile had once completely undone her, and now made her want to smack it off his face. Or kiss it. One or the other. "I certainly wouldn't object to that, but what I meant was to the lines. After my speech, after this charming festival is over." In spite of herself, Vivi felt a little thrill at that. She'd never visited the ley lines, which lay in a cave on the mountain opposite from Elaine's mountain. The cave was a sacred space, only ever visited, as far as she knew, by Penhallows. She'd be lying if she said she'd never wanted to see them, to get close to that kind of power. "You said you wanted to. Before," Rhys went on, pushing his sunglasses back into place. And then she remembered it. The solstice revel, the two of them in a tent, her head spinning with magic and desire and the sheer thrill of this man that night. "You know, we're not far from the ley lines here," he'd said, kissing the tip of her nose. "The source of all the magic in this valley. My ancestor laid them down himself." "Oh, I didn't realize I was making out with visiting royalty," she teased, and he'd smiled at her, kissed her again. "I've always wanted to see those." Later, whispered against the warm skin of his neck. "I'll take you there." He hadn't. They hadn't lasted long enough for that little trip. But now he was offering it again. Was it a peace offering? Or a deeply misguided seduction attempt? She looked into his blue eyes and realized she really had no idea. And at the same moment she realized she also didn't care. Getting up close and personal with the ley lines was an honor few witches got, and she was taking it. "Okay, sure," she said, and then just in case he got the wrong idea she added a poke to his chest. "Besides, you owe me." "I don't know, after the attempted murder, I'd say we're at the very least even," Rhys replied, and then when he saw her look, drained the rest of his coffee. "Fine. I owe you. Now show me to this welcome booth. And let's get this over with." Chapter 7. "You don't think we have the same nose, do you?" Rhys studied the head of his ancestor, currently lying at the base of its statue. Whoever had sculpted the unfortunate Griffith Penhallow had gone into a lot of detail. The curling hair over the brow, the slight frown and expression of noble suffering in the eyes, and an absolute beast of a nose. The mayor, Jane, was still unspooling a line of caution tape around the broken statue with one hand, and barking into a cell phone held in the other, so she didn't answer, and Rhys sighed, touching the bridge of his own nose. "Bad luck, old man," he said to Griffith's head, then looked back up at the top of the plinth. The speech had been going so well, all things considered. Rhys figured the accent did most of the heavy lifting for him, plus the novelty of having an actual penhallow, all the way from Wales. And he'd understood that this was the kind of thing people liked kept brief. Let's be honest, they were really here to buy candied apples and hand-dipped candles, not listen to him blather on about his dead ancestor. So thanks for the warm welcome, a quick acknowledgement of the beauty of the town, a few sentences in Welsh, always a crowd pleaser, and he'd been done, one duty discharged. And then he'd nearly had his own head knocked off his shoulders by Griffiths. As soon as he'd stepped onto the little steps leading off the stage, he'd heard the crack, then the gasp from the crowd, and had some instinct not urged him to freeze, he would have been directly under the plummeting stone skull of Griffith Penhallow. I am so sorry, the mayor said for what Rhys thought was at least the 35th time. I don't even know how this happened. She was still holding the bright yellow tape, her cell phone shoved back into a holster at her waist. In her heels she barely came up to his chin, and even though Rhys suspected she'd replaced all of her blood with Red Bull, she was definitely attractive with her big dark eyes and flushed cheeks. However, being nearly killed for the second time in 24 hours had something of a dampening effect on the libido, so he didn't even attempt to flirt as he replied, "Hardly your fault. Probably just Griffith letting it be known he would have preferred a different Penhallow, and I can't blame him for that. I'm just glad no one else was standing nearby." He was smiling as he said it, but as Rhys glanced back and forth between the statue and the head on the ground, something cold settled into his chest. Last night had been one thing, a series of mishaps that it was easy to chalk up to a strange run of bad luck, his magic thrown off by crossing an entire bloody ocean. This felt different. Heads didn't just break off statues, certainly not exactly as he was walking under them, and after assuring the mayor one more time that he was fine and didn't plan on enacting some extravagant revenge for this insult, Rhys headed across the street to Vivian's family's shop. A chime rang as he pushed open the door, something slightly off-key and haunting, and just above him, some sort of animatronic nightmare of a raven began to squawk and flap its arms, its eyes blinking purple. "Subtle," he said, and from her spot at the cash register, Vivian's cousin Gwyn raised her middle finger at him. "We're closed." "You very obviously are not. We're closed to any and all exes of Vivi's, and you qualify, Sue." Nearby, a group of young women was looking at a display of leather journals. Rhys saw a hand-painted sign advertising them as grimoires, but he couldn't detect even the faintest hint of magic coming off them. Probably best not to sell the real thing to tourists though, and as Rhys looked around, he realized that very few things in the shop radiated any sort of real power except for Gwyn herself, decked out in full witchy regalia today. He'd met her a handful of times during that summer he'd lived in Graves Glen, back when her hair had been pink. It was red now and long, hanging nearly to her waist, and while she didn't look that much like Vivian, there was definitely a resemblance in the look of scorn she was throwing his way. "Did you miss my near decapitation out there?" he asked, nodding back out at the street. Gwyn widened her eyes. "Wait, one of my dreams almost came true, and I didn't get to see it? What dreams?" Vivian appeared from behind a star-spangled curtain in one corner of the store, a box of what appeared to be tiny skulls in her arms, her hair gathered up in a messy bun, and as she blew a strand out of her face, Rhys's heart kicked painfully against his chest. If only she weren't so damned pretty. If only he hadn't been the biggest cock-up this side of the Atlantic 9 years ago. If only he didn't suspect, just the littlest bit, that she might be behind his sudden rush of ill fortune. He didn't want to think that, but for the past few minutes, ever since he'd looked up to see Griffith's nose careening toward his, it had been there, muttering away in the back of his mind. It seemed a little too much of a coincidence that the second he arrived back in Graves Glen after 9 years away, everything went completely sideways, and while Vivian had never struck him as all that vindictive, she had left him to be killed or eaten or run over yet again last night. All of which he probably deserved, but that was not the point. Now he looked at her and asked, "Do you sell a scrying mirror in this store by any chance?" From behind the counter Gwyn snorted. "Yeah, right behind our jars of Eye of Newt. What are you, 1,000 years old?" Scrying mirrors were a little old-fashioned, even for witches, but so was Rhys's father, which meant that they were one of the better ways to communicate with him. "I think there actually might be one in the back," Vivian said, setting down her box of skulls. As she did, several of them opened their jaws, letting out a sort of creaking groan that made the girls over by the grimoires jump then burst into giggles. "Seriously?" Gwyn asked, leaning on the counter. "We have a scrying mirror and I didn't even know it? I found it in some antique store in Atlanta," Vivian replied before glancing over at the customers, then back at Rhys. Moving a little closer she lowered her voice and said, You can't use it in here. Mimicking her whisper, Rhys replied. Wasn't going to. She frowned a little, a wrinkle appearing between her brows, and Rhys's fingers itched to reach out and touch it, smooth it away with his fingers. As that was a terrible idea, he kept his hands firmly in his pockets. You good out here? Vivian asked Gwyn, who gave her a thumbs up. Now that I have more noisy skulls to sell to noisy kids, I am set. Folding her arms over her chest, Vivian looked at him and after a moment, jerked her head at the curtain in the corner. Come on. Rhys followed, and when she pulled back the curtain, he expected to step into a storeroom of some kind, some dusty shelving, a bunch of cardboard boxes, much like the back room at Llewellyn's pub. Instead, he immediately found himself in a circular chamber. The walls a warm honey-colored wood. Heavy iron chandeliers held fat candles that cast the entire place in a sort of cozy glow, as did a series of stained glass globes affixed to the walls, spilling colored light onto the comfortably shabby rugs on the floor. All around the room were a series of beautifully carved wardrobes, and Vivian walked to the nearest one now, opening it and muttering to herself. This is quite something, Rhys said, looking around, and when Vivian looked back over her shoulder at him, her expression was a little softer, a little more familiar. Aunt Elaine likes things to feel homey, she said. Why have a boring, depressing stockroom when you could have this? Then she looked around. I mean, it does sometimes make me feel like I'm in a video game of The Hobbit, but still. Rhys huffed out a laugh and she smiled at him. Just for a second. One of her front teeth had the tiniest chip in it. He'd forgotten that. He'd loved that. That little imperfection in that sunny smile. Then she turned back to the wardrobe and Rhys cleared his throat, moving back slightly. And if customers come back here? Vivian reached farther into the wardrobe, digging in its contents. They don't, she said. Slight repelling spell on this part of the store. Elaine tweaked it so that they don't feel uncomfortable or scared, they just don't want to walk in. That's rather genius, actually, Rhys said, impressed. It was one thing to cast a spell, but tailoring it to your specific needs took a fair amount of skill. Turning back to him, mirror in hand, Vivian raised her eyebrows. Yeah, well, we don't all have to be fancy Welsh witches to know some kick-ass magic. Well, as this particular fancy Welsh witch is currently getting his ass kicked by magic, I cannot disagree with you there. He reached for the mirror, but Vivian didn't offer it, watching him with another one of those little frowns. What do you mean? Sighing, Rhys dropped his hand and rocked back on his heels. Just that when a man nearly meets his death twice in less than 2 days, he begins to think something may be afoot. She was still frowning and had gone very still, and Rhys watched her carefully, looking for some sign. Of what, guilt? Did he really believe that Vivian was out to get revenge after all this time? Over a relationship that hadn't even survived an entire summer? He didn't. Not really. Or maybe he just didn't want to. In any case, as soon as I have that, he went on, nodding at the mirror, I can talk to my father, and make sure my charging the ley lines is a good idea given the fact that Griffith Penhallow attempted to kill me. When Vivian just kept staring, Rhys filled her in quickly about the entire statue incident, finishing up with, So see? If you'd stayed to watch my speech, you would have gotten quite the show. Are you all right? She asked, looking him up and down, her lower lip caught between her teeth. The gas lamp nearest her cast red and blue patterns over her hair, picking up the little sparkles in her purple sweater, and Rhys stepped forward, holding out one hand. I'm fine. Or I will be once I use that. He nodded at the mirror and Vivian handed it over, the metal still warm from her hand. Why are you using this to talk to your father anyway? She asked, her shoulders a little looser now, some of the tension leaving her face. It's for telling the future, not communicating. Rhys didn't even know exactly how to explain his father or this particular eccentricity of his, so he just shrugged and said, More fancy Welsh witch stuff. Got it. So I'll just... You'll probably want some privacy, she said, reaching up to tuck one of those loose strands of hair behind her ear. I mean, if you'd like to stay and meet my father. Vivian wrinkled her nose. From what you've told me about him, I think it's best I pass on that. I'll be out front. With a swish of the starry curtain, she was gone, leaving Rhys standing in the middle of the room, holding the mirror and dreading every bit of what came next. Sighing, Rhys held up the scrying mirror and looked into it. He was scowling, an unfamiliar expression on his own face, and one that, he realized with a bit of shock, made him look an awful lot like both Wells and their father. If that's what this place was doing to him, he definitely needed to leave as soon as possible. But first this. Muttering the words under his breath, Rhys pressed his free hand to the mirror's cool glass and felt it ripple under his fingertips. It only took a few moments before his father's face appeared out of the swirling gray mist in the mirror. his library clearly visible behind him. "Rhys?" he asked, his fearsome brows drawn together in a tight V. "What is it?" "Lovely to see you too, duh," Rhys muttered, and then his father's frown somehow deepened. "Where in the bloody hell are you? Is that some sort of theater? A fortune-teller's wagon?" His father's face loomed closer in the mirror. "Rhys Merdut Penhallow, if you are consorting with fortune-tellers. Duh, I only have you for a tick. Can I tell you why I'm calling?" Simon's expression cleared slightly and he leaned back, waiting. As quickly as he could, Rhys told his father everything that had happened to him since arriving in Graves Glen, from the car trouble to the near-miss accident to the statue. He left out the bit about not having hot water for his shower this morning as he was fairly certain it didn't help his case, but by the time he was finished, his father looked almost amused. "What a terrifying prospect." "You're not cursed, lad," Simon assured him. "Penhallow men cannot be cursed. Not in over 1,000 years has one of us fallen victim to any sort of hex." Amusement gave way to smugness as he added, "All of this is no doubt a direct result of your decision to travel like a human rather than via the traveling stone, as I suggested. A head fell clean off a statue because I decided to fly commercial and rent a car? Is that what you're saying, duh? Because I'm not sure I see the correlation." Now the scowl was back. "That was actually a bit comforting. Have you charged the ley lines yet?" "Not yet, no. But that's the thing, isn't it? What if I am cursed and that, I don't know, buggers up the ley lines or some such? While I do not doubt your ability to, as you say, bugger up most anything, Rhys, I am telling you, there is no possibility you are cursed, and even if there were, some girl who barely qualifies as a hedge witch could not have done such a thing. Not to you. Not to any of us." "She's more than a hedge witch," Rhys said, his fingers tightening around the mirror's handle, but his father waved a hand. "Whatever she is, I'm telling you there is no way she could have placed a hex on you. It's ridiculous. Preposterous. Bit like talking to people through mirrors, really," Rhys replied, and his father's gaze sharpened. "Do the job I sent you there to do, boy. Come home and don't ever let me hear the word cursed leave your lips again."